I'm with Eilish with this being a participatory session, so hands up, start shouting anything that I start talking about. I have a habit of going off course if I start thinking about things, so just steer me back in. I'd much rather have a conversation with you all than lecture about this, but it is very interesting, and I hope you feel that it's interesting too. And more than that, I hope you feel it's something that you can maybe relate to as well. So yeah, I'll crack on. We've discussed my name, we've discussed that history. I've been at the V&A now for about 6, coming up for 7 years. During that time, I've sort of focused on 2 major areas of work. They're split pretty evenly. One is crisis management and kind of working about how the institution as a whole functions in an emergency. The other side of it, which predominantly takes place outside of South Kensington, is about this. It's about cultural heritage protection. We do it through a program called Culture in Crisis, and I promise I will get there, but what I'd like to start with today is a little bit about how I got to what I'm doing and a little bit about the institution as well. I've got some notes down here, but now I realise you're all up here, and this is probably a symptom of having spent the last year and a half doing presentations online, that I was half expecting to have a kind of forthright presentation. So forgive me, I do have quite a lot of notes, and I do that just so that I stay on track more than anything. But yeah, it's a bit of a neck stretch doing both. So hello at the back. If I don't look at you for very long, that's why, I promise. So as I just said, I started off studying history and ancient history at university. I sort of cherry picked what I looked at by doing 2 subjects. You can do that, and I ended up going quite a lot into the kind of social history in a contemporary world, or kind of modern history as they call it. And within ancient history, I looked more at philosophy and the arts. And the link between the 2 areas there was really about how people relate to culture, the artistic things that they produce, but also their relationship with it. Why did they value what they valued, and why do we do that today? Both from a contemporary perspective and from a historical one as well. I didn't always work at the V&A, no. I took a job working at North London Gallery, and that again really informed where I was moving through cultural heritage. The collection, as Eilish mentioned, it's a really interesting collection. I do suggest that you look it up. It's mostly works on paper, so paintings, sketching, drawing. And it was all donated through a period of 100 years by predominantly Jewish artists who had come to the UK and started their own cultural organisation, artistic organisation, because they wanted an outlet to kind of perform their culture and to kind of share that collective experience. 100 years later, those artists have become some of the kind of cornerstones of British art. And it's really interesting as a person who had arrived there in sort of 2010-ish, to look at that collection and actually think about the social history that was involved in that process. And I did a lot of programming around, I suppose, the importance of art to people, but also the kind of really difficult histories that a lot of those objects talked about. And also, it's not the subject of today's talk, but I got very involved in the entire history of Nazi looting during the Second World War, and predominantly targeting Jewish works of art, collecting them, destroying them, selling them, which has left a massive legacy in museums and collections around the world. And there's a lot of work going on to restitute those objects to owners that have been dispossessed of them in around the 1940s. So we get to this point, so I'm doing exhibitions, doing programming, we're doing publishing, and I think you sold it too lightly there. I moved it a lateral direction, partially because I wanted to expand my skill set, but also because it's a lot to do, and I wanted to focus more attention. At a larger institution, for anyone who's sort of been involved in small arts organisations, you'll know you do absolutely everything all the time. And I'd actually recommend it because you do get a lot of experience in dealing with different things, different people. And I'm a die-hard generalist. I love a bit of everything. So until I find the one thing, unless cultural heritage is one thing, I've really focused on a lot of things before I got to the V&A. I promise I have more slides as well. The V&A. Just to sort of, as I moved across, I got to the V&A and I started exploring different avenues of work. And I was very lucky because I made a categoric error on my second day of working there. I introduced myself to a new, very senior colleague with the statement, "Oh, I know who you are, I'm really into art theft." And it turned out that chap was the director of security, who sort of drummed himself up to all state of kind of power and authority and said, "That's the worst thing anyone could ever tell a director of security at a national museum." And after a bit of explaining, actually, I'm more interested in the kind of concept of art theft than doing it, we got on really well. He took me on to start running the Culture in Crisis program, and it's been kind of this ever since. I'll come back to that later, but first, it's always a good question with a show of hands. Who's been here? Nice one. Great. Cool. Everyone else, you're welcome to come and have a cup of coffee with me anytime you want. The V&A's been there since 1857 in some form or shape. It's been growing organically since then. It's been kind of amassing extra bits of building, which is a pain in the ass for everyone in our estates department, but it looks beautiful. 2.8 million objects is actually a little under what we're currently at. We're at about 3 million objects now, and that's everything from kind of massive stone monuments all the way through to paper ephemera, sketches. So, you know, when we say 3 million objects, some of them are quite small. And they're not all stored at the South Kensington site. In fact, only about 12% of objects are stored in the museum itself. Everything else is in storage. But we're still doing quite a good job. It's still a solid amount of objects available. But we are doing more, and I'll come to that later. 7 miles of corridor if you want to walk the whole thing. During lockdown, I was one of about 5 people who were allowed on site during lockdown 1 to check the state of the museum. More in my crisis management hat than in my culture in crisis, but I do believe there is an overlap more than just the term. And it's a big space, and there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of legacy there as well. Pre-pandemic, we were on about 4 million visitors, but obviously that number's pretty much been decimated, so we're up to about 30% of what we used to have at the moment. For an institution that started growing in 1857, we never really stopped. On the slide here, you can see a variety of different V&A sites, some of them local, some of them a bit further away. I won't ask you to name them, I'll do it really quickly. V&A Dundee at the top left, V&A Shenzhen in China at the top. We've got the 3 sites that sort of go across in a diagonal line are all actually conceptual drawings at the moment. They're all in process. They're all in East London as well. So if anyone's been to the Museum of Childhood before, that was in Bethnal Green. Yes, thank you very much. It's being sort of redesigned, reignited as the Young V&A, which is a departure from a kind of Victorian view of childhood, if anyone's been there before, into a centre that's focused much more on design, imagination and play for children between 0 and 12. All for children of all ages. The other 2 buildings, which are in the bottom left and the top right there for you, the other 88% of the collection that isn't in South Kensington is going to be in that artist's rendering in the bottom left-hand corner. It's an accessible storehouse for the public to come and explore, which is opening in the Olympic Park. So for those of you who know it, the Here East building that runs along the canal, that's where all our objects will be by 2025. And you can come in, you can explore the collection. It all belongs to you, by the way. It's a national collection, which means that it's owned by the public, and we hold it in trust for you all. So you all have rights to access what's in that collection. Come and exercise them. Do some research, explore what we've got, tell us what you think about it in 2025. And in the meantime, we're also building this very tall triangular building, which is V&A East. Has a director, Gus Casely-Hayford, who is currently working to design this incredibly dynamic museum project. So it's everything that a future of a museum should be. So as we're talking about the kind of process of heritage protection in historic sites, please do bear in mind that it's also quite nice to do some future thinking too as well. But before we speak about the future, we should think about the past. And this is a really difficult one for an institution like ours. The past isn't an easy thing for a Victorian institution that's steeped in colonialism. It's something that's still felt in the present today, and it's felt in the objects that we own and display, how we collected them, how we interpret them and position them to the public, and also how we organise our gallery spaces as well is all part of a colonial construct. And it's something that not just us, but a lot of museums are thinking about at the moment and trying to deal with. It sometimes feel like you're working at an institution that feels like a miniature version of the world, and conveniently we do things like name our galleries Japan, Asia, Buddhism, Europe, and it's these kind of big overarching structures that really need to kind of be explored in more detail in the future. But actually what I'm really interested in and want to talk today about is how do museums work to look outside of their institutions to perform a role in a civic space that exists beyond South Kensington or Dundee or Shenzhen. and to look at the potential purpose and function of those organisations for the world beyond. And there's a lot of questions to deal with in this presentation, so I'll try and start off by asking you guys some. I've got 3. Hopefully they are conversation starters as much as there are deliberate answers to these. I'm really interested in what people outside of museums think about when they think about museums, because I'm very much too much inside the system to know. What's the purpose of a museum? What would you use it for? Who do you think about when you think about museums serving the public? And finally, what sort of things do you think about when we use the phrase heritage? And I've been reliably informed that you're all very conversational and you like talking to each other, which is great. Because I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, please. Just talk to your neighbours, enjoy your snacks if you don't like your neighbours, and have a think. But I am going to come back to you and have a quick chat about what you think about these top 3 questions. 2 minutes whilst I have a drink. Really loud, everyone. Eilish, I want to hear that word. That's brilliant. The linguistic importance of that word is really important. Oh my God, okay. I was working as a What did you say? Ah, amazing. I don't know what that means. So in a lot of languages, the actual term that people use for culture and heritage comes from the Latin origin of patria, which is essentially a very male-dominated... You'll explain it? You're like, what? Come on. I don't know what I can give you, but gold stars. Oh, it's really interesting because it's something that I came across quite late, and I was like, oh, we all use this term, and it doesn't really exist in English, but I think it says a lot. Okay, wait. Yeah. So sorry.
The answer I gave you it will be also the answer for the second one. What is the purpose? Okay. They are. Yes.
Like what sort of thing? Yeah. Is that good or bad? Great. We've got 20 seconds left on the clock. All right, everyone. Let's round it up. Thank you very much. See, I'll just use this to shout instructions. Yeah. It's quite good. I feel like I'm at a theme park. Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you for actually engaging with that. It's really rewarding to see. I've done this with groups of students before, and it goes one of 2 ways. And the other way is me talking very awkwardly for about 3 minutes. So I'm really glad that you gave me a chance to have a quick break there. Who's feeling confident, comfortable? Don't make any sudden movements if you're not keen to contribute. Oh, we've got a point. Great, fantastic. In the industry, we call that voluntold. So.
For the first question,
yes. Space. Interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that?
As I explained to my colleagues here, a museum doesn't have to be something related to the past. It can be something present. Like if somebody comes in this room now and asks each individual person a question, that's basically turned into a museum of people, right?
Yes.
Like each story goes like in a museum or like a...
Phenomenal. That's really great. When
it's a context as well.
Carry on.
Yeah, it's space or context.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Like a framework.
Yeah, framework. As we move forwards, I want you especially to think about a term I'm going to use in a bit called intangible heritage as well. Anyone else? I'm going to pick on you because I heard it. You were really close and it sounded great. So.
Okay. To museum, I associate the protection, because I think the purpose of a museum is to protect the art patrimony we have left from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Ding, 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 ding. What
Ding,
does
ding, ding.
patrimony mean? I don't know.
Like a treasure.
Like a treasure.
So, for a number of languages, the word culture, the word heritage, the word associated with museums comes back to a Latin origin of patria, and it holds a lot of connotations. And I'm not a linguist, so if anyone would like to stand up and explain this more eloquently than I am, go on.
Because I'm Greek and I have to.
Yes, please.
It comes from the cultural heritage, which that's question 3.
Yes.
Museum, it comes from the Greek word muse, which is like from the old 3 muses we have for poetry, singing, etc., etc. But also it comes from the Latin word to lend, which means to give something away for others to see.
Fantastic. I love this. I could do this for the rest of the hour, but I promise to actually, contribute to the conversation as well. Before we move on, just the last ask anyone. Has that sparked any interest from anyone else who wants to contribute? Anyone going to nudge a partner really hard because you heard them say something really great?
Michael's smiling.
Go on.
Wait, what?
Being punished for smiling, Michael.
Wait, which question?
Any you like.
I was going to say that the purpose of a museum is like a safe space for culture and heritage.
Lovely. Really
So,
nice.
Not locked necessarily, just open for everyone to see.
Yeah. Balancing that idea of protection, access, help giving to people, but also preserving things. I've heard some awful definitions or scary definitions of museums as kind of, hotels of death or to the prevention of death, to hold things in stasis for time. And I've got time to debate that as well, which is wonderful.
One more before you move on.
Go for it.
The second question, what is the purpose of the museum? I associate it as a physical encyclopedia.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. A bit of everything across the world, which is obviously an endless task, isn't it? Trying to create the museum of the world would be a very difficult job. Is it a desirable job is another question. Is that something we need, a bit of everything, or do we want to break it all down into other... I'm digressing. I told you it would happen, but you've all done really well of actually kind of addressing these. I wanted to talk a little bit about the responsibility of museums as well, and talking about how there is a lot of expectation placed on them, especially in a modern world where the truth is often comes with a small t and it's all a bit flexible and interpretable. Quite often museums are held up as kind of bastions of truth. We show you things, we tell you things, and quite often they're seen as an authoritative structure. What we're seeing more and more now is trying to engage more with like multiple narratives that come into those objects. How do we explain things in different ways to different people? Less kind of one story for one object, and actually looking more to the future about how we tell different stories inclusively. And that, to go back to the trust thing, it bothers me mostly because a survey came out last year by a big research agency that said that curators were in the top 5 most trusted professions in the country. It was a UK survey, and that's behind, I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget, it was behind nurses. We all love nurses. Doctors, librarians. Actually, nurses score higher than doctors, which is fun. Librarians and teachers. So we sit up there. People look to us for a kind of knowledge structure and to be honest and trustworthy. So when I talk about curating, I talk about projects like this, please do bear in mind that I think there is a lot of self-reflection that should go on to this. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with running programs, and I can't say everyone always gets it right, including myself. So I've spent a long time talking about museums, and actually I was here to talk about the program, so I'm going to do that as well. This was our founding manifesto, and it's really big and overwhelming, but I've just tried to sort of break it down into little bits so that, especially when I read it, I don't feel quite so intimidated. But it comes from this idea of the museum as an international organisation, and we have objects from around the world. Therefore, we commit to protecting the world's heritage, supporting communities that suffer loss, whether through conflict, criminal acts, or natural disaster, which, heads up, is almost anything that could happen. Crisis in the culture and crisis world is a very broad term. And the programme brings together people with a shared interest in protecting heritage, providing a forum for sharing information. So that word forum, we were talking about frameworks, we were talking about spaces, to inspire and support action and raise public awareness. So there's a lot of advocacy tied up in this. And I stress really that collaboration and collective movement really sit at the heart of what we do, and we're focused on developing inclusivity through that professional practice to create more engagement within institutions, which I guess often can be focused on what is exceptional rather than what is collective or community based, or there's lots of, which I think, you know, there's equal importance in as well. And I said also that we'd be talking about heritage protection, so it's probably worth talking about the risks that heritage face. I've already talked about conflict, criminal acts, natural disasters, and that is actually the sphere in which we work quite a lot within. And it all sounds rather extreme. I should also balance this out that culture disappears for other reasons. It can be gradual erasure, it can be kind of politicized, I'll come to that in a bit. But the big ones we often deal with are those three, the criminal acts, the natural disasters. But I've put these pictures up, and I made the slide a while ago, but I think it's quite nice just to revisit it and think about some examples within them. Climate change is one of the biggest and most aggressively expanding risks to heritage at the moment. So rising sea levels, big impact. Change in temperature, humidity, longer summers, wetter summers, drier, you know, all these kind of environmental impacts are affecting not just people, but the heritage that they have as well. Looting and the illicit trade. I'm only going to touch on this today, but we do a lot of work with international policing that prevents the looting and trading of cultural property, art, heritage, archaeology, and also things like urbanisation. So the rapid growth of cities, often, you know, with development as a cornerstone, it can often erase people's heritages in the process, and you see kind of big urban expansions that happen quite often to the detriment of the cultural heritage or the societies or the communities that live within those spaces. And a term that comes up quite a lot, where perhaps in the UK, is gentrification. In other places, it's incredibly extreme. It is the literal depossession of communities to make space for urban development. And there's loads more. I won't wait for too long, but just to stress that these issues don't happen in isolation either. They all compound, and it's a nice image, isn't it? Everything's getting worse, but it's not. Stuff is happening that's good as well. Yeah. Why is heritage targeted? This is a big one, and I'm never going to do it justice in the time that I have, so please do forgive me, but I'm going to try and talk about a few of these things on the screen. So as I said, heritage doesn't just disappear. It might die out, might, you know, kind of be erased over time. It might even be accidentally destroyed. But what I'm talking about here is deliberate destruction of cultural property. Things that are meaningful and willfully destroyed. Willfully? Willingly. Willfully. Thank you, guys. Very good. And each of the pictures on the right there demonstrate kind of cornerstone events, in my world at least, that symbolise the kind of deliberate targeting of cultural property as a means to achieve other aims. Does anyone recognise any of these incidents or places? Yeah.
Did you say the one on this side is like Babylonian civilization?
It's Assyrian. It's Elamisu. Yeah, great spot. Especially because I've cropped the heck out of it, haven't I? Yeah. Anyone else? I sort of saw a hand. Anyone? I'll go through them all very briefly. So the Bamiyan Buddhas were the first to go in 2001 by the Taliban. So that's the bottom right-hand side for you all. Sorry, I've got a picture here, so that's why I'm sort of staring in here instead of doing my neck in. Basically, it was a Buddhist history in Afghanistan that the Taliban didn't really want to exist. And they sent warnings to the international community, told everyone that they were going to blow it up, and they did blow it up. And it was an international outcry, and everyone got very upset because it represented more than what it was. It represented the targeting of people and religion. Moving on, we've got the Mosul Museum, which is, yes, as the gentleman at the back pointed out, this was ISIS 2015, destruction of kind of ancient civilizations that didn't fit with ISIS's agenda of a kind of Islamic world, that this was predating it. So it was all about targeting and creating a narrative which they could push in the region. And they carried on. They had Palmyra, which is the bottom left-hand picture. You've got the guy holding the photograph. That's what was there. The bit above it is what's there now. And that's a site dating back 3 millennia. That's been there since, really we're talking beginning of kind of human recorded history in terms of like the classical world. And it's been everything from a mosque to a shrine to a church to a crossroads in the Silk Route. So it's had all different cultures living there. And ISIS took it out. And they took it out really dramatically because they before they blew it up, they staged executions there. They did a lot of kind of video productions because they knew the symbolism of it, not just to people who lived in Syria, but to people of the world. So it had like a kind of force multiplier effect, which is the term that they use in the military and in humanitarian working as well. And finally, the earliest one, I should have started in a kind of progression, although it's a pretty depressing progression, but the bridge that you can see there is the Mostar Bridge. That came down in the 90s when Croat paramilitary forces, during the Croat-Bosnia War, this bridge kind of stood as a symbolic bridging of a city. It was very famous at the time because not only was it a physical kind of architectural wonder, it was also very symbolic in that it bridged two communities. And the paramilitary unit knew that. They knew that by destroying the bridge, they not only got a great military target, but they also symbolically destroyed the connection of those two community groups. And it was, not to go too much into the kind of history of the war, but it was about dividing ethnic groups within the region. So it served a purpose. It was very symbolic. And sorry, that's all rather depressing, but we'll come on to some of the nicer bits in a minute. But just to sort of summarise, there are other reasons that people destroy heritage. It can be focusing an attack on a specific group of people. So we see that when we target religious shrines or perhaps looking at specific cultural areas that are being destroyed. It can be used as a show of force, as I was mentioning. Things are filmed, they're broadcast, they're sent around the world, they're sent as a kind of message to other people. It's a political thing sometimes as well, and it's used to create international outcry. So I never know how much of a bubble I live in with things like this, but there are moments where heritage becomes front page news, and maybe it's not one of these, but I'm sure you'll all remember Notre Dame fire sent ripples across the world. That really was an emotive subject for a lot of people. In that case, it was a fire that wasn't deliberately caused, but the destruction of heritage nevertheless caused not only a massive outpouring of kind of collective emotion, religious importance, it also had cultural significance to people who lived there, but also beyond. People were posting pictures from holidays they'd taken years before as a kind of connection to a heritage that they felt had some relevance to them, even if they're 1,000 or 2,000 miles away. But I think that's the kind of thing that is really powerful to me, is the fact that people can land those connections, that they can make those kind of important personal moments amongst things that are quite often seen as monumental. That was the bad bit. This is the nice bit. So if we're destroying it, we're also preserving it, and that's what we really are involved with doing through the Culture in Crisis programme. There are a zillion types of heritage. We've got the kind of traditional way of looking at it is like the big built physical environment. You've got churches, monasteries, monuments, Notre Dame. That we call that monumental heritage, we call it physical heritage, we call it tangible heritage, built heritage. Everything seems very constructed and physical. But a lot of the work that we do is around intangible heritage, which falls more into the common practices or cultural beliefs of different groups of people. So I'll sort of talk through some of these images because they sort of elaborate more what I mean by intangible heritage. So preserving heritage can involve things like storytelling, preserving a collective memory, or archiving information. And that's an image at the top left, which is people preserving historic books in Sri Lanka. And that was manuscripts that otherwise hadn't been digitized or accessed before. We've also got a group of Bedouin youths who live in Jordan in the desert, coming together to talk about how nomadic lifestyle had changed in the modern era, and actually how they told stories and how they communicated with different groups was in itself an act of preservation because it continued that storytelling tradition. And you can't quite see from the image, I don't know, but all those images on the floor are kind of historic documents, and it's fabulous, really. We also have the more traditional stuff, building, rebuilding, restoration, renovation, all those kind of terms. And there's an image there of children assisting in the redesign. I think this was Syria redesign of cities to include more kind of cultural spaces. So they were assisting with that. And also there's another project, the World Monuments Fund funded a load of Syrian refugees living in Jordan to train to become stonemasons. It's a mouthful. Whilst they were living in exile. So they were able to talk about, learn, and produce the kind of very specific, I'm looking at the picture here, sorry, very lovely kind of carved ornate structures that would support them in rebuilding their cities in a way that they wanted, rather than kind of importing massive development that quite often results in just kind of very cookie cutter high-rise skyscrapers, and they were really keen to make sure that their heritage was reflected in the Syria that was reborn after the war. We've also got really scientific stuff like conservation of objects, and that's actually one of my colleagues in the lovely goggles and high vis working on a V&A object. And so it can take that kind of much more scientific route of conservation of historic objects. But to be honest, and I don't hide my bias very well, what I get really passionate about is the intangible kind of performative cultural events that take place that really do work to preserve heritage. The bottom right is a Sicamese Festival. Does anyone know where Sicam is?
India.
Yes. Didn't used to be. It used to be its own region, and it was absorbed by India, I think in the 70s, correct me if I'm wrong. And the kind of heritage that existed in this northern tip of northern tip of India was quite unique. And the project that took place here was about reviving that. Sort of after the absorption, it was almost a bit like, okay, well, what actually makes us us? And these events were put on to kind of sort of reinvigorate some of that historic culture, but also very contemporary life. Yeah.
Oh, I just want to ask, isn't the destruction of some heritage a good thing?
Ooh, yeah.
I mean,
Great question.
A lot of these pieces are built on the corpses of like community, or not literally, but you know.
Number one, really glad that you put your hand up to say that. And number two, would love to have a cup of tea with you after and discuss this, because it's such a big topic. How can we preserve everything? How do you prioritise what we preserve? Who gets to choose what's important and what's not? Can big organisations like, who's heard of Unesco? UNESCO run what is called the World Heritage Site Programme, where you can get something listed and it is literally given a big banner and it says, this is important to the world. But only governments can apply for that kind of level of accreditation.
Laura, can I add something on this?
Yeah.
Because we are now in UNESCO Heritage Site. You know, Greenwich is a UNESCO
Yes.
Heritage
Yeah.
Site. And I give you some insights on that. From that part of the road, from Stockwell Street to this, when they want to build this particular building, we have to take consultation from government, policies, UNESCO, the world in general, in order to be able to build this new building in 2014. So on the other side of the road, where you see Café Rouge, who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, this kind of thing. So all the Greenwich area is a protected UNESCO site, and this building is part of it.
Okay, so that's 2 cups of tea I now need to have, because who likes football? I'm a big fan of football. Who likes Liverpool? I don't like Liverpool, I support Everton, it's the opposite, but I'm from Liverpool originally, or my family are. And Liverpool has the same thing. The waterfront in Liverpool is protected by World Heritage status. It's protected because it's big, it's old, and it's fancy, essentially. And Everton Football Club decided that their old stadium needed redeveloping because Goodison Park's been there for a really long time. So they've expanded to the waterfront, but in doing that, they've got into this debate. Can they build something new on a site that's protected for being old? And the city and the club decided, yeah, we can, because actually we think it's more important to have the football club and put our heritage status at risk than it is to preserve this historic site. And it raises this fantastic debate, which I promised I wouldn't talk about. I put it on the last page of my notes and just sort of put it to one side, but I'm really passionate about it. Liverpool lost its World Heritage status because of it, and it's fine. It's surviving. The buildings are still there, the 3 Graces as they're called, sit on the waterfront, and the buildings are fine. The club is going to do really great as long as we don't get relegated this season, but that's another question. And what we're really looking at is a contemporary cultural value. Someone has said, no, to be a Liverpudlian or to be an Evertonian requires a football pitch, and we want that. That's our lived culture, and that's as valuable as stone and masonry and big impressive monuments. And actually what we're seeing now is that both can sit side by side. And I've done it again, but I hope that was interesting, at least a little bit. I'm really enjoying this conversation. We've got 15 minutes left, and there's bits of my presentation that I think I can skip over, and I want some questions and some time to sort of talk a little bit. So I'm going to speed up slightly, and also if you have more questions, please carry on. Hands up. It's really interesting for me, at least.
Also, you all know that we're going to the pub afterwards to continue, because I think there's a pin in that question that you just said, because also I want to discuss the destruction of statues recently for problematic people.
Yes.
You carry on, and we're coming back to that. We have to.
Oh, I've got loads. Sorry, everyone. We do loads of work with loads of people. Here they are. We're quite unusual in that a lot of museum people, I'll go back here. A lot of people, when they think of museum, they think of curators, and it's really annoying because there's loads of departments in a museum and they all work really bloody hard. So these are some of the departments that I work with. Collections, absolutely. Conservation, certainly. But also research, digital department, designers, learning teams that want to work with the communities that we work with, events team, because we couldn't do events without them. And also, bizarrely, I sit in a security department, so we'll talk about that another day as well. And outside of the museum, again, we work with non-traditional partnership. There's loads of logos up there, and I wish I'd sort of changed a few of them. Excuse me, given the conversation that we're having now, because these are all big and impressive people. And actually what I really wanted to stress today, that it's less about working with the big important people, more about working with people like the India Pride Project, who are a community-led organisation that's sort of has incredible success at finding stolen, looted statues that have been taken from shrines in India, trafficked out of the country and sold for exorbitant fees through different auction houses, which I don't think I can name, but you can all find out if you Google. And the really important thing to consider there is that organisation, IPP, does it because it considers those statues to us to be gods. They are living gods that need to be worshipped, that need to exist within a sacred space. So Vijay and his team do phenomenal work actually getting those objects, finding them firstly, which is really difficult, and then bringing them back to India. So to stress, as much as there are big names on there, we also work quite a lot with smaller teams and from non-traditional groups as well. We do it through a public programme, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the things that I came to the programme and insisted upon was that we moved from the metric of one big international conference every year into doing ongoing series of events, so that we could keep a conversation going, that we could get people together. And prior to COVID, that was a really kind of physical experience. We'd have an auditorium like this, and I would do a much better job at keeping to my time, and I'd invite very exciting people to come and talk. And then really importantly, we wouldn't kick them out at the end, because the conversations that took place in those 10 minutes while people grabbed their coat or want to respond to something a speaker said or someone that their neighbour was talking about were just as important in terms of building networks, developing relationships, and being that forum that we pledged to be in our outset. Alongside those conferences, we did the Culture in Crisis series. We also do podcasts and audio series, and during COVID, we went to the interactive webinars. The audio series I put in here because you're all design-related students, which I think you might be interested in a series I did a few years ago. We took design with a kind of very liberal interpretation and looked at different design structures that contribute to protecting heritage. So architects, 3D designers and modelers, but also much sort of broader than that. Like, how do you design, maybe you can read it. The recruiting of the modern monuments men. So anyone who's seen the movie Monuments Men will know what that's about. But it's about the kind of how do you design and implement a new military unit that works internationally. And we worked with Colonel Tim to do that for a number of years before it went live. Anyone who's into a bit of true crime, we did a podcast series on fighting the illicit trade of cultural property, everything traced from the kind of archaeological digs that kind of take things out of the ground through all these kind of nefarious networks and who's been trading and who's been selling and who owns, and eventually who gets to have to send things back. Anyone recognise that gold coffin? Any fans of Kim Kardashian might, because she famously tweeted an image of it, which set forth a massive global issue because that coffin was looted from Egypt and ended up in the Met. And the Egyptian authorities knew that it was looted, and they raised a lot of questions about how much research the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York had actually done before it acquired it. And it was forced to send it back, rightfully so. Some more of the events that we did. So we broadened the question, actually, what does heritage mean in terms of sustainable development? What does it mean in terms of rebuilding cities with a cultural lens? How can we use evidence of cultural destruction, which is a war crime, by the way, to kind of convict people of destroying people's heritage, which is very difficult to do traditionally. We ran a load of conferences around the world, and that was really interesting because you can deal with the big questions there. And we're going to do one at the end of the year in Dundee, looking at why heritage is relevant to different people and how can heritage organisations retain relevance or adapt relevance or show and reflect relevance. We're still in the early stages of that, so I can't actually give you the answer just yet. And this one was just to show that the interactive webinar series that we did was a bit of a shift, and I think a lot of people, everyone saw that, didn't we? We all had to go online, we all had to do things differently. So I moved all my events online, and that gave us actually quite a lot of opportunities to do things differently. And some of it's really successful, still learning. But what it allowed us to do was to really diversify access to our audience. So normally, if you want to come to a Culture in Crisis event, you have to come to South Kensington, which is fine if you live maybe in London. You know, sometimes we've got people coming from a bit further afield, but by going online we could really engage with the network we worked with internationally, and we did. We got really good uptake. I think we had around 250 different people kind of attending each of those sessions, and for one series that we did, we were able to have speakers from 12 different countries contribute in different panels. We introduced different things like youth moderators, so people who were in like early careers between 16 and 24, who could kind of like platform their opinions as well. Like you. Not to cast aspersions on your age, but yeah, it is certainly something that people sometimes struggle. I think we can all empathise. If you're in a big auditorium full of people, it is terrifying to put your hand up and try and contribute something. So what we were trying to do is promote this idea that different voices have different thoughts and none of them are, you know, categorically wrong. And it really pushed me actually, because I learnt a lot about the way people work. And I put this picture up because I think this is one of the best things we did, is we involved designers in the process to do live illustrations of what we were talking about. And I'll tell you what, 6 years in the business isn't a lot, but it's enough to tell me that I don't like the fact sheets that people produce at the end of events that say this is what we said. I love these. I'd have a go at another one of these for everything I do if I had the artistic skill. And most of the feedback that I've had from people who came along to the events, especially those that have a kind of background in the arts, was saying this is the sort of thing we should be talking in a language or a visual description that we can all kind of get on board with. So it's a nice picture to kind of end with. I've got loads more to say, and I actually would really like to hear more about what you guys are up to. So I'm going to cut out this bit. We built a wonderful website, and every heritage preservation project that we can find out about exists on this database. It has, so sorry, I'm really self-editing in my head as I go, but what I want to stress here is that the issues that we found were everyone's doing heritage protection on their own. It's a very siloed work, so you might travel out to Syria, you might go out to Yemen, you might be doing these projects, but it's very rare that there is a collective approach. So what we wanted to do was democratize access to that and include more people in the project, in the process. So we set up a website, which in our very early planning phases, we described as a news agent board, where you could come in and put up what you were up to with a contact number, and someone else could wander into that news agents and say, oh, I quite like the idea of that, I'll take a name or a number and I'll go and talk to them. And we built a website equivalent of that. So to this, 3 years later, skip ahead, spoiler alert, we have over 16,000 visits to the site from 189 countries, which is for me, just phenomenal in terms of the type of people that are logging on to explore heritage protection projects taking place around the world via our portal. They're spread across 6 continents, and for the life of me, I have no idea how to get Antarctica involved. But if anyone's got any suggestions, I'm open to them. And we just actually went, we've got over 1,000 projects on there. The easiest thing I can say is go and have a look. It's quite interesting. Pop in anything that you're interested in, whether it's, you know, woodcraft or crafting ceramics or, you know, architectural history. Use the search engine to explore what different people around the world are up to. And if you're really into it, you can connect with other people that are doing that work and try and take things forwards. And we have no part in that. We kind of let you crack on, and we assume it's all good. But that is where I'll probably leave it, because I wasn't joking. But if you do want to have a conversation with me, please do. If you want to write something, this is the email address you can use. We do a lot of programming, so if you want to join the mailing list, just drop me a line that says, here, please, can I join the mailing list? And I'll send you lots of hopefully interesting events that you can come along to. Or if not, tell me what you think. What's important to you? What is heritage to you guys? And actually, what do you think is important to preserve or not preserve or prioritise? And yeah, I'm sorry I went on about Liverpool for so long, because that's the other 3 minutes that I hopefully was going to share with you all. But that's it.
Thank you so much, Laura.
You're very welcome.
Sip your drink, because I think there's going to be loads of questions. I know I've got loads.
You can
Who
start.
wants to kick us off, please? Questions for Laura about her career, questions about debate topics about culture in crisis.
I will ask.
Oh.
Because I like asking questions.
I love trying to answer them, so it's fine.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Laura. I mean, it's like great to have someone from such a massive institution. VNA, for me at least, it was and it's going to be one of the most inspirational places to be. For those that haven't been there, this space is a free museum where, except there's exhibitions that happen periodically, where it's a space you can go, you can have a coffee, you can think, you can look, you can go, you can come back again, you can even meet your friends. Anyway, so the question is that you mentioned some point about the heritage, you mentioned about culture. It is a destination where people meet, as I said, and they come from different backgrounds, visitors in London or locals or from other places. When it comes to the background or back of the scenery of what we see in the museum, there are jobs or people that are engaged with a number of things, from security, as you said, to cleaners, to designers, to curators, to whatever else you can name it. We have here graphic designers, we have here animators, and those people, they're going to be looking for jobs. And the first thing they're going to be looking is something which is very, in their head, looks like the next step to do. Creative industries, check online, find a job for them. When it comes to places like a museum, how would you think that those creative people can engage with the museum, how they might be finding a job in the museum, what the museum can offer them behind the scenes? And I'm saying that because, I know this is very long, I'm saying that because in 2001, I remember I exhibited work in the Sackler Center.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So I exhibited my work there for the first time, that was 21 years ago, and the VNA gave me this opportunity as a designer to do that. So from that perspective, what kind of opportunities exist there for these students?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's no, all the good ones are, and hopefully by the end of it, normally people answer their own questions if they're long. It's good. For us, it's about breaking down the idea that the museum is a monolith. It's one thing doing one exhibition in one place. And actually, the programming that takes place at institutions like the V&A, at Tate, at other organisations that are design focused, it's all in that. It's in the London Design Festival, which takes place every other year. I feel. Yeah. Or the festivals that take place within gallery spaces that aren't necessarily exhibitions but displays. I've done a lot of work with our events team before, and some of the things they put on are sort of mini conferences. So I'm going to one in a couple of weeks now, which is about sustainability and future design based around the concept of wood or the forest. So the V&A has a really eclectic way of categorising its collection, both in a material specialty, so we have departments dedicated to things like sculpture, ceramics, metalwork, glass, and we also have furniture. But we also have the Asia department, and we have kind of geographic departments. So each one of those departments does different things, and all of them exist within the world's largest and greatest museum of design. So it's about interrogating it, it's about looking into it. It's not always about jobs, it's about participating, because you're going to find much more opportunity to participate in group projects or in kind of the activities that take place, and make those networks and try and work around the system, because some people just arrive and stay. I've got colleagues who have been at the V&A for 35 years, and it is a slow system to work your way into, but there are so many dynamic pieces of programming that you can get involved with, and especially East London. I would really suggest that you guys have a little look around what's been published about V&A East. It is all the things a modern museum is going to be doing, hopefully, and it's all about working with the community, and you guys are the community, and it's about looking outwards and bringing people in to participate. So try that, hopefully, if that answers some of it.
Could I pick up on...
There is a very good also, you didn't mention, there is, maybe the first years they have already visited, but there is on the first floor, second floor, is the V&A library.
Yes, the National Art Library.
Yeah, which is an amazing place if you want to go and see books,
Yeah.
artist books. So like you have to go online, you have to order it, and then they specific time. Is that how it works, right?
It's just reopening, so it had to close because of COVID. It's really hard to sanitize special books. You can't just rub a antibacterial wipe over them. So they had to come up with a really clever way of kind of decontaminating books. So it's just reopening now, but the National Art Library's collection is all online. And it's this beautiful space. You can come and spend a day working and reading and exploring. And like I said, with the collection, it all belongs to you. So you can request any of those books. And some of them are.
Online, you request,
Yeah.
then the next day or the day, whatever,
You can go and
the
get it.
book is going to be there waiting for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And we're talking about like creative, nice pieces of work.
Definitely. And just to like follow on answering Anastasios' question, to follow on what you're saying, Laura, in my bio I didn't know how deep to go into your career journey, because
I feel like you're about to expose something terrible.
it's something great though, and I really wanted you guys to hear about this, because what you're basically saying there is getting involved in these networks and sustaining relationships. So this is one of the programs at the V&A that you're now all invited to participate in and to come to and to make those networks. Or depending on your area of interest, there's a million other programs happening at the V&A.
I'm quite happy to put you in touch with people. Send me an email. Tell me what you're interested in. Tell me what you want to do. I'm excellent at spamming people.
She
and I'll
is
put
a
you
good
in
spammer.
contact. Yeah.
But this is what I was going to say. So this is a skill that Laura embodies really well in her career story. So Laura went from managing a gallery, which sounds pretty grand, doesn't it? Like finishing uni and then finding a way to manage a gallery. You kind of think, oh, I'm going to stick here. I'm going to stop here. I'm a manager of a gallery right now. I'm curating. I'm doing my thing. But she had her eye on a network that interested her. She had her eye on this art theft guy that she was a big fan of. And so what Laura actually did in her career was she took a sidestep to what was actually more of an admin-facing role, a less creative role. But that was in order to infiltrate herself into a network and to sustain that network. So when I met Laura, because I was working at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I haven't worked there now for 6 years. But like I said, we keep this professional relationship because we're really interested and excited by those topics. So it's about being open and honest about your research excitements as well, and not being afraid to tell people about those things.
And the programme runs on the creativity of others. I'm not afraid of saying that. It's about being a platform. It's not about me being the solution to the world's heritage problems. It's about getting people involved and getting people to discuss it. So, I mean, that sounds like a massive cop-out, doesn't it? I don't have to be right, but you guys can contribute, can't you?
Sure.
I was going to ask that, like, how people get the chance to go into a museum and choose a piece of art so they can exhibit that, or how they can take place of that.
Ooh, yeah. So in terms of what your colleague was just saying earlier about coming in and accessing books, you also have that option for a specific area of the collection called the prints as in like printed, and drawing room, which is a similar theory, but you can request artworks that are on paper. Not all of them, some of them, but we do open the collection up to academics, to people working in institutions like this who want to come and visit specific objects from the collection too. I have to give you a terrible caveat, which is that we're currently in the process of moving that 86% of the collection from Blythe House in West London to East London. And in the process of that, all of that object, we call it object circulation, is out because they need to pack it into a box, move it to East London and unpack it. But that is exactly what East London is going to be in 2 to 3 years, depending on the building. It's about you coming into that building, looking around you and seeing floor to ceiling objects that you can access and talk to and request and be a part of. And I'm hoping there are more museums that are thinking the same way in the future, because 12% isn't enough.
True. Do we have any more questions, Jake?
What's it? I don't know too much about it, but like, there was that whole thing about museums, like most of their stuff being stolen, and so there was like that sort of question, like, oh, should we give it back and like sort of lose all this like knowledge and stuff?
They call it restitution, which is a fancy word for give it back, because you stole it. I really, really would like to debunk the myth that everything in museums is stolen, because a lot of it is really generously gifted by artists, creators, producers who are willing to kind of give those objects or sell them to collections. So it kind of undermines the idea of the museum as a receptor of kind of huge amounts of creativity that are being produced by people. But big institutions like mine, I should have gone back to a picture, have a massive colonial legacy where throughout those centuries of colonialism, people travelled the world specifically with the intent of finding objects that spoke of other cultures and bringing them back to the UK to put them on display. And it's sometimes they will, considering the power dynamic, given willingly, that's a big question mark. Can you willingly give a colonial power something that belongs to you? But it's also about taking. It's about conflict. It's about a lot of the stuff that I'm dealing with right now, and it's seemingly a massive legacy that we deal with as an institution. So no, not everything is stolen, but certainly there are contested objects in the collection. The V&A don't have as many as, I hate throwing mud at the British Museum, but Bloomsbury's got some problems.
You know what Laura said? I said to Ariadne, don't mention the Parthenon gallery.
You can mention them to me. I'm an ancient historian. I will talk to you all day.
But there are a lot of clothes in the V&A. For example, David.
Yes.
Or other things, which for me it's extremely important, because that museum somehow brings like something which is not authentic.
Yeah.
But it brings this cultural heritage in the space, and it works well with other pieces that are real and authentic pieces. And for me, that's why the museum itself is so powerful.
And that the basis of the V&A was originally science and industry was the origin of the V&A. It was after the Great Exhibition, people were really interested in the process of making, of learning, and that's kind of sat at the heart of the V&A for over 100 years now. So the cast courts are what they are like plaster casts of famous objects from around the world. So you can see Trajan's column, you can see David, you can see the Great Gates of Spain and things like that. So they were designed and cast and brought to the UK to teach people what other cultures were like. And they were an educational tool. They are gigantic educational tools, and they are most people's favourite part of the museum. And they are inherently unoriginal. But a lot of museums did this. I can't claim the V&A were alone in doing this. The sort of Victorian era did see a lot of this cast making. But then as time went on, a lot of museums destroyed their own cast collections because they thought actually what conceptually is called the aura of the original was too great. They thought no, and actually to be true, it needs to be not a copy, which I think a lot of them are regretting now.
I've got a cool fact actually about Michelangelo's David, the cast that Anastasios is talking about.
Yeah.
So, has anyone seen the original Michelangelo's David?
I was working there in the Galleria dell'Accademia.
Wow,
Oh my goodness.
Well, you'll be able to tell me how wrong I am here, but I heard a sneaky little rumour that poor original David has a crack forming up his shin, and it might be a terrible, terrible injury for David. If David falls down, which he could, the V&A's cast of Michelangelo's David, which is a really, really old cast, it was a fake made years ago, thankfully not a stolen object, a fake made, could be the historic relic of Michelangelo's David that stands, which is so exciting.
That is, and it's not unique in that respect. If you're interested in that kind of thing, reproduction and art and what authenticity kind of means, I can give you one terrible piece of literature to read, which is, I don't mean terrible, I mean it's just really difficult to read. It's called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and it's all about kind of thinking about the birth of photography and film and how that impacts what we perceive as true and real. And I can't remember the guy who wrote it. Walter Benjamin.
They read it last year at home.
Oh God!
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Great, that sort of theory. But also something much more readable. Sorry, you all probably loved it, and I've just slammed it. How embarrassing. The V&A did a project called REACH, REACH, Reproductions of Art and Cultural Heritage, and it dealt with a lot of those questions, and we travelled around the world to a number of different museums who had engaged with copying and discussed what the original premise of copying in the cast courts meant in the modern world. So would it be about free and I mean free in the kind of like let's let it be financially free, sharing of digital files of art, which is not always free, so copyright can get in the way of that. Yes?
But wouldn't the copying of artworks and pieces be also beneficial to the impact of climate change? So like something could be destroyed, but you still have a replica of what it was.
Yeah, and I mean that isn't in a way a physical form of archiving, isn't it? It's that idea that if we can't stop it being eroded quite often with cultural heritage, what's the best thing to do? Do we remember it for what it was, or do we kind of produce a new one and say that's what it is? I found out today this fantastic fact, which made me very worried, because I spoke to a criminologist who works in underwater law, which sounds wild, but we were talking about the protection of underwater wrecks, and actually because of climate change, the Titanic is only expected to be there, I wrote my notes so I can sort of look at the date, for another 20 years before the bacteria in the Titanic wreck literally just kind of eat it alive. And what do we think is important there? Do we think we should scoop it up? Incredibly expensive, might break in the process. Or do we 3D scan it? Do we create a complete replica through using this great technology we now have to kind of scan and print a version of Titanic? Or do we just sort of accept the loss? And it goes back to the question from earlier on from you. It's like, at what point do we realise we're just building on top of the metaphorical and physical bones of ancestors at this point? And there has to be a tolerance, in my mind, for some loss. But whether or not it should be the Titanic, I'm not sure.
There's an exhibition going on right now, which is for the Titanic. We're planning to go to an immersive experience.
Yes, where is that?
I'm not sure where exactly, but it's here in London.
Yeah.
It's like an immersive experience, and they have like actual artifacts from the Titanic, the one that sank.
Yeah.
And Charlie and I, some friends of ours, are going there, and student tickets are just £13.
Wait, that's amazing. I'm personally interested in that from a social history perspective, because I think it's one of the first times that we saw narratives and a real collecting of human stories, individual human stories on that boat. Yes.
I actually have two questions.
Go for it.
The first one is, free museums, how do they actually survive? From where do you get all of your resources to maintain everything?
Lovely. I've got that answer. Go for the second question, because otherwise I'll forget to come back to you.
The other question is, who and on what basis decides what culture stuff needs to be given back For example, I come from Bulgaria. For example, in my country, the territory has been invaded quite a bit of time. For example, there are some Turkish objects found in my country. Like, why should we give it back? Like, who decides that?
I'm glad I asked for both questions because that second one is a big one. The first one's relatively simple. It's a constant balance of trying to provide access, but also making the money elsewhere. So I think it was the late 90s, specifically in the UK, there was a real push, kind of championed by the then director of the British Museum, Neil McGregor, who is possibly one of my favourite museum people in the world, who really thought that art should be for the people and therefore we should all stop charging people to come and see what belongs to them. But museums to this day still struggle to work out whether they were making more money with ticketed entry or less money because it's free but they get more people. I get a spreadsheet every week that says what the average visitor contributes to the V&A in terms of donation boxes, and it's about 13 pence. And it's gone way down since COVID, but that I remember being colloquially about what we got. So it's not that we've just replaced it with donations. It's things like we sign contracts with caterers that pledge a certain amount back into the museum. We hold corporate events in the evenings that big fancy people throw massive parties at the V&A and pay. Is this bit being recorded?
Yeah.
Pay an adequate amount of money for the exceptional experience that they then receive. And it's all in that balance. It's about what a museum can do. And I think, personally, I think museums should be free because I travel the world a lot and it's not the norm. It's like, even in Europe, you pay quite a lot of money to access quite a lot of the collections. And it's such an inspiring thing to be able to take a lunch break and walk around a collection of international importance and do that. I'm definitely coming to you, because I feel like it would be a massive disservice not to answer your second question. I absolutely can't. But remind me just what. So let's think it through again. Who decides why it should go back, and at what point do we think about it?
Yeah, like if the artifact itself was found in a certain country, not stolen, not given, found there, who decides it has to go back to where?
Yeah. We do a lot of that. So it's this big divide between a legal argument and an ethical argument. And quite often, a lawyer I really like told me that ethical arguments often predate the legal ones. So a lot of people who want restitution don't have a legal leg to stand on, in that the law has either expired, it's too late, we can't legally bring something to court, or they don't have a physical person to return it to, because theft is a really technical legal term that involves something called tort of conversion, which sounds fascinating, but I just like to throw it in because it's a great word. But it requires a person to return it to. So actually it's really rare to be able to return something to a community, and that's a legal issue, because if you want to return something, you have to create kind of a structure of law to facilitate that. And actually a lot of people are just saying, okay, well, if you can't do it legally, let's do it because morally it's the right thing to do. And that is really difficult for some museums, because as I've stressed, it all belongs to you, which means that if we want to give away any of it, there is a law. There are only about 4 reasons that we can give away objects, and none of them are helpful. If it's broken, if it's a duplicate, if it can be proven to have legally been stolen, trafficked, and things like that. But to go right back to the start of my presentation, I talked a bit about Nazi loot, and in the Washington Convention of 1997, oh, my law is poor tonight, I'm so sorry. I should have got a coffee, not a peppermint tea.
This is impressive.
They created a legal precedent that returned to the heirs of Jewish victims of looting those objects. And some of those objects had been through multiple hands into multiple collections, and now 50 years since that's happened, it's actually become 50 years. It's become actually a really good example of a legal structure that can facilitate the return of objects that we can prove were stolen, because the Nazis kept incredibly detailed records of what they took from people, incredibly detailed. To this day, like, we've got a provenance research curator at the museum who accesses these files and says, I can tell it's gone from here to here to here, and it should go back there. But at this point, there is not an equivalent law that deals with things like colonial repatriation, which would require a return to a country rather than an individual. So that's what we've all got to hope for, that someone comes up with a great legal loophole that we can all exploit. Sorry, I did say I'd come to you as well.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the museums and having to pay for them, because there are some museums in Lisbon where you have to pay to go in, but there is this one museum which is only like around certain times of the year, which is usually September, because Lisbon had a huge earthquake hundreds of years ago, and everything was covered over. But then while rebuilding the city, they found the old city underneath it.
Wow.
And so, like, only certain times of the year, because the tide comes in, it gets filled up with water, so you can only go and see it during like the months of September. So you can go in, but it's really, really hard to get timestamps.
Yeah.
Because it's free.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. And also, I bet it's being affected by climate change.
Probably.
So those tides will shift and move. And
Yeah.
fascinating. I've been to Lisbon and I'm really annoyed I missed it.
It's really beautiful. It's like a completely under city, so they just have everything open, and you can see like skeletons as well that people who died there as well.
Wow.
Really cool.
Phenomenal. Thank you. It's on my list.
Great. Don't you think like replicas are kind of like whack? I mean, I feel like not every piece is meant to last forever. Art must die at a certain point. Like, not everything is McDonald's. And I don't know, like, you'll throw me in a style if I make replicas of like photocopy CAD, but like with art, it's okay. Like, what's more valuable?
What's more valuable?
Yeah, is money more valuable than art?
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
Value.
A situation where like that's part of the narrative, but I don't know about David though.
I unfortunately believe this comes down to literal individual, the way we see the world. I mean, maybe it's too much philosophy studied at university, but I do believe that that kind of sense of fulfillment or happiness can come from, for me, an original object. Maybe it's because I'm a historian, that the actual authenticity of the past is for me a value. But I think that's a hyper-personal way of looking at it. I don't know if, I mean, way beyond my pay grade to be deciding what value is. Also, fun fact, we don't put values on objects. We know roughly what things might be worth on the open market, but most things are considered either unmarketable, because you couldn't sell them if you wanted to, because we can't, or national collections can't afford to insure their collections, so we put in other efforts to protect them, but we don't do it from a financial perspective. We can't actually put a price tag on things. We can put a price tag on repairing them if they get broke. We can insure them against loss if they're put on a plane and go somewhere, but it's really hard to get anyone to commit to putting a price tag unless they've bought it at auction. It's a very philosophical question. But I'm very personally interested in value judgments and whether they come from internal or external kind of value judgments. So who gets to do that? Are people moving because I should stop talking?
I was just thinking, we've got questions coming up and I'm desperate for them to be answered, but I'm also noting the time. Should we continue this discussion over the road? It would be fantastic, because I'm just thinking closing times, our lovely filmers.
Or the email address.
Or the email address, of course, because this is an open conversation. And I think we've ended on a really nice note about value, and about the value of our interests and of our personal stories and our cultural stories. I know I have a lot of answers that I want to share with all you guys about my feelings about this, and I want to hear yours in the pub, and Laura wants to hear yours in the pub.
I really do.
And Laura wants to hear yours in her email inbox. So for now, can we give a big round of applause to Laura, and thank you so much.